Hello and welcome to a special Smaulgld update on initial coin offerings. The SEC today issued a report saying that initial coin offerings may be subject to U.S. securities laws. A lot to unpack here. Let's get to it. The SEC warned issuers of initial coin offerings that they may be subject to securities laws. Now, whether an ICO is subject to securities laws will depend on the facts and circumstances of the offering. The SEC today, however, decided not to take action against the ICO of the Decentralized Autonomous Organization, or DAO. Many ICO tokens may not meet the SEC's definition of security, and that's going to be important as we cut through what the SEC said today. So they issued a press release and an investigative report today warning generally that offers and sales of digital assets by virtual organizations or initial ICOs are subject to the requirements of federal securities laws. The report noted, however, that whether a particular investment transaction involves an offer or sale of security, regardless of the terminology or technology used, it will depend on the facts and circumstances, including the economic realities of the transaction. So what they're saying is, it doesn't matter what you call it. If it's a security, we're going to deem it such, and we're going to grab that regulatory authority that we're supposed to have because we're called the Securities and Exchange Commission. So if something is a security and it's going to be issued or sold to the public, the SEC is the body that regulates the issuances of those securities. And part of that regulation is to require what's called a registration statement, which has enumerated disclosures that the issuer must file with the SEC unless there's some type of exemption from registration and it's claimed by the issuer. So the issuer has to put together a registration statement that has a prospectus in it, which is an offering document. It's a very arduous task. I've worked on them in my career, and it involves disclosing all the financial and other material information about the company and the security it intends to sell. So it's not just information about the company, it's what's actually being offered and basically what rights and that particular financial instrument has. Now, this registration statement, as I mentioned, is very to file it. It's a very arduous task. It's very expensive. It gets reviewed multiple times by the company's internal and external lawyers, the company's bankers, and they send it then to the SEC staff, and then they look at it. And they don't approve it. What they do is they declare it effective after they're satisfied that they've asked all their questions and they've sent out their comments to the company. The company has responded. And the SEC is satisfied, although they don't approve the registration statement, that the securities can now be issued pursuant to a registration statement, which the SEC deems effective. Now, if the registration statement or anything in the prospectus contains any untrue statements of material fact, contains any omissions to state material facts, the issuer may be liable to the purchasers of securities issued pursuant to that registration statement or prospectus. And the officers and directors of the companies could be subject to criminal liability. Now, there are exemptions from the registration requirements under the Act, and these include forms of private placements where you make small offerings to qualified institutional investors or to a limited number of accredited individual investors. And generally, accredited means they make a few $100,000 a year or they have a certain amount of assets. So basically, the SEC is saying that these people can fend for themselves and they don't need to have their securities registered in a public filing. However, generally due to potential liability, and these qualified institutional investors and rich people, they can demand full disclosure, and generally a lot of private placements have pretty much the same disclosures and the same type of prospectus and registration statement type disclosures that a public filing would have. So it's always good practice for an issuer who wants to sell securities or sell something to the public to give full disclosure. The investors demand it and they don't want to be liable. So it's not like you can get out of disclosure just because you happen to be selling to institutional investors or rich people. But here's where the crux of the issue is, whether the SEC actually has the jurisdiction over these ICOs. Because remember, when Bitcoin was out, for tax purposes, for commodities regulations, for securities regulations, we haven't heard from the SEC what Bitcoin is. What the CFTC said was it was a commodity. And for tax purposes, that's taxed differently. And since it's not a security, or the SEC hasn't claimed that Bitcoin is a security, well, now they're saying that these tokens issued in ICOs are a security. So maybe what they're saying is that Ethereum or Bitcoin are commodities, and then you use those commodities to create the ICOs, and then the ICO tokens are securities. But let's hold on a minute now, because the word security is a legal term. And you can see here, I'm not going to read it to you, but you can read it on the Smaulgld website. It's basically what you would think of a security, a stock, a treasury stock. But the most important thing about a security is that somehow it gives you some type of ownership right in a particular entity. Now, an initial coin offering that is issuing tokens may not meet that requirement, the literal definition of securities. So indeed, when deciding whether a purported security falls under the Act's definition of security, and therefore subjects the issuer to the registration requirements, where they're going to make that big document and file it with the SEC, an important factor is whether such investment instrument gives the holder an ownership interest in the company. Now, there was a Supreme Court case called SEC versus Howey Co., and the court held that a land sales contract, at least that's what the defendant called it, a land sales contract, whereby he would go out and buy land suitable for growing oranges. He'd sell that to the investors, but then there would be a contract where the investors would basically give Howey the right to farm the land and grow the oranges, and then in return, Howey would give the people who bought the land but turned over the rights for him to farm it the profits from the sale of the oranges. Now, the SEC said you can call it a land sales contract, but basically that's an ownership interest, that's a security, and so form was disregarded for substance and emphasis was placed upon economic reality, so said the court. So if you go back to the beginning and what the SEC said today, they're basically saying in the report, whether a particular investment transaction involves the offer or sale of security, regardless of the terminology or technology used, will depend on the facts and circumstances, including the economic realities of the transaction. They are not saying that ICOs are securities. The tokens issued are securities. They're saying depends. And they're giving themselves a bit of leeway to say, and it depends, and you may want to call it, not say it's a security, you might want to call it a token, but if we see under the economic realities of the circumstances that it is a security, we're going to call it a security. But let's see what happened here, though. It gets a little tricky here. Stick with me. So they're definitely trying to claim that these ICO tokens, if they're securities, well, then they fall under their jurisdiction. So not in the press release, but in the investigative report, they went through the DAO circumstance. That's what they looked at. And they said, here's how they described it. It was created by Smaulgld IT and its co-founders with the objective of operating as a for-profit entity that would create and hold a corpus of assets through the sale of the DAO tokens to investors, which assets would then be used to fund, quote, projects. The holders of the DAO tokens stood to share in the anticipated earnings from these projects as a return of their investment on the DAO tokens. And here's the kicker. The SEC also concluded that the DAO tokens were securities, but decided not to take action. So the SEC determines that the tokens were securities, and if you remember, if they're securities, then any securities offered to the public under the Securities Act of 1933, before they're offered, there has to be a registration statement filed, and that registration statement has to be declared effective by the SEC. Well, that didn't happen, or there has to be an exemption claimed. Well, there's no indication that the DAO claimed any exemption. So it seems that if the SEC is declaring that these DAO tokens were securities and that they were issued, well, then one can only logically conclude that they did violate security laws rather than may have violated the securities law. So that's strange. The SEC is saying, look, these DAO tokens, according to us, they're securities. And this entity may have violated the law, and we're not going to take any action. Now that seems very strange, because if they were sure that the DAO tokens were securities, then there's no reason whatsoever not to then follow up and say, look, we're going to hold you liable for having an offering of securities as defined by us, and you didn't have them registered. Case closed. Well, maybe the SEC took this seemingly contradictory point of view because they weren't certain a court would agree with them that the DAO tokens were securities. Remember, the issue in these types of token offerings are, in many cases, these tokens are not, the DAO, the whole organization is not owned by anyone or any group of entities or any individuals, but it's software running on a blockchain. You have a token, maybe not even ownership interest. Maybe they gave you something as worth something else. It's just part of the company. That's not a security under the definition of security. So if that's the case, and you have no ownership interest in a company as a result of your token ownership, therefore the tokens may not be properly deemed to be securities. And a court may say, hey, SEC, you bring a case, SEC versus Smaulgld and DOA, and you say they violated the Securities Act. Well, the plaintiff's lawyer for the Smaulgld and the DOA is going to say, what security? We don't have a security. We're not selling a security. And the SEC is going to trot out what they said. Well, here's why it is a security. But what if the court says, no, that's not a security? Well, then the SEC does not have jurisdiction over a particular token issued in this fashion. So what the SEC, I believe, was trying to avoid was a test case. Because if a token was brought forward by the SEC and said this is a security, and it was issued in violation of the Securities Act because it wasn't a registration statement, and the court said, no, this isn't a security, what do you think is going to happen? Every company is going to try to avoid the SEC oversight, and they're going to structure their tokens and their ICOs just like the one the court said wasn't a security. So what's next? First of all, these ICOs are a threat to Silicon Valley and Wall Street. The initial public offering process is a cash cow for Silicon Valley and venture capitalists, firms, and Wall Street bankers and lawyers. They get paid a fortune to take companies public, to write these prospectuses, to market them, to sell the securities. And as a result, the VCs and the bankers control which companies go public. All your Facebooks and your Twitters, they pick a certain kind of company in some respects that have a certain message, and they receive vast amount of capital in the process of bringing these companies forward. So it's a very closed group. It's Silicon Valley, Wall Street. They work in tandem. The VCs in Silicon Valley find the companies, they bring them public through Wall Street, and they make great fortunes. Now, ICOs are an existential threat to the IPO market because they bypass Silicon Valley and Wall Street completely. But they also pose a regulatory risk because people just buy these ICOs based on hearing some guy on a YouTube channel saying you got to buy this ICO. And everyone jumps in. They have no idea what they're doing. They just think it's going to go up. They heard it's going to go up, so they buy it. Well, if ICOs were not subject to SEC oversight, they may continue in their current form, and that's why the SEC put this announcement out here saying, warning, warning, warning. They may violate the Securities Act. So people who want to do ICOs are going to lawyer up. They'll probably start making better disclosures. And really what I think they want to happen here is, I don't think they want to bring an enforcement action because they risk losing it. If they want to go after an ICO and they lose and the court says this is not a security, then it's open season. I think what they rather do, the SEC, is, and they declined. They said they're not bringing an enforcement action against this DAO or the Smaulgld. They may ask Congress to give it broader authority to regulate ICO specifically, and then what they'll do is they'll make a definition of what a token is, and it'll include everything in the kitchen sink. So anytime you even think of using the word blockchain or anything that has to do with tokens or Ethereum or anything like Ethereum or blockchain or issuances of anything, that'll come under the SEC's purview. I think they want that power. So if they don't have it now under the existing regulatory structure, I think that's what they're going to go for. They're going to ask Congress to give them that authority. Now, if SEC does gain that type of regulatory control of ICOs, well, then basically you've got the same crowd all over again. The Wall Street crowd, the Silicon Valley crowd will then be the ones who know how to navigate through the regulatory environment and bring these ICOs public. Now, longer term, that type of regulatory structure, it may sound kind of anathema to people who like the Wild West, but it probably would bring even more money into the cryptocurrency space. It would bring in, the people who are not on the fringes, but the mainstream investors, if they knew that they could buy an ICO with all the protections of the SEC and a full offering document. So I don't think people have thought through, not that I have, I've only had a couple of hours to think about this, but I think a lot of people are just saying the SEC is cracking down. And that doesn't mean the end of anything. That just means these things are going to evolve. Thank you very much for listening.